Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the British Columbia Museums Association webinar. My name is Raene Calvert, and I will be your host for today. Today's webinar topic is Heritage Conservation, the Basics and Tips, presented by Raene Poisson, Object Conservator. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that as an organization of provincial scope, the BCMA recognizes that its members, today's presenters, and attendees occupy the lands and territories of BC's Indigenous peoples. We ask all of you to reflect on the places where you reside and work and to respect the diversity of cultures and experiences that form its richness. As I mentioned, I'm Raene Calvert, your host for today. I am also the BCMA's programs coordinator. My pronouns are she, her, and I want to thank you for joining us today. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please do email our office. Vanessa, our operations manager, is standing by to assist. A small bit of housekeeping before we begin. Please use the chat feature to ask questions or make comments. I will read your comments or questions out to the host. There'll be time at the end of the presentation reserved for Q&A. The chat feature or the Q&A button may be hidden on your screen, so you just need to hover your mouse at the top or bottom of your screen, and a taskbar should emerge where you will see the chat icon, which is displayed on this PowerPoint slide, or you may find a button that says Q&A. You can use both. I'll check both of those. In an effort to improve accessibility, there is a live transcription service available. You should be able to see a closed captioning button in that taskbar where the chat and Q&A is. If you want to click on that, that should allow you to have live transcription service enabled. However, if you do not see that, there should be a Live on Otter AI button on the top left-hand corner of your window. If you click on that, a separate website will open in your browser so you can read the transcription as we move through the webinar. As with many things this year, this is a new service to us and we are testing it out, so we appreciate any feedback provided about this service. As I mentioned, this month's presenter is Raene Poisson, Object Conservator, and this website is funded through the BCMA microgrant. I'm going to pass it on to you, Raene.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the great introduction. I'll just get my screen shared here and we will be good to go. And so again, today I'm talking about the basics and tips of heritage conservation, because even in the heritage world, we all need a little help, even myself as an objects conservator. And so if it goes to the next slide here, there we go. So what exactly is a conservator? What is conservation? So conservation are actions aimed at safeguarding the cultural heritage for the future. The purpose is to study, record, and retain the culturally significant qualities of the cultural property as embodied in its physical and chemical nature with the least possible intervention. So essentially, we want to keep the object as it is for historical and cultural integrity. And so my job as a conservator is the person who has the education, the knowledge, ability, and experience to formulate and carry out the conservation activities in accordance with an ethical code. There's a longer description up there, but you folks can read it later. And so essentially, as a conservator, we go into the agents of deterioration. And now these were identified by the Canadian Conservation Institute, or CCI, as the main agents that can affect your collection. And these are what I'll be starting with today and going over. And so CCI is the agency within the Department of Canadian Heritage, and they advance and promote the conservation of Canada's heritage and collections through its expertise in conservation science, treatment, and preventative conservation. So they do a lot of work with institutions and professionals to make Canadian history and culture available and accessible for Canadians now and in the future. And so they developed these 10 agents of deterioration, which I'll go through today. So there's fire, pests, thieves and vandals, light, incorrect relative humidity, water, physical force, pollutants, disassociation, and incorrect temperature. And now these can all affect your collection differently as well. Knowing about them is important as there are steps to mitigate them. Some effects are minor, moderate, or in some cases severe. And I'm bringing these up because everyone in your institution or even yourself, as a personal collector, or you're just trying to take care of, heirlooms in your home, these will help you care for them as well, being aware of these agents and knowing how to mitigate them. And so the first one we'll start with today is physical forces. Now, force is anything that's directly applied to an object, and it may result in compression, punctures, dents, tears, cracks, chips, scratches, or abrasion. Essentially, any physical or mechanical force you apply to an object. Now, some examples you might know of are dropping an object. Maybe the object got crushed in an overfilled storage box. Maybe the item was on display and it got knocked over by a baby stroller or a walker. I actually just saw a lady with a walker smack into a piano the other day. Maybe the object is damaged while being transferred to another location, maybe even just in the institution, or it's being damaged while it's being transferred to, a different museum on loan. Maybe a weak point was used to pick it up, like in the picture. Things like handles are especially susceptible. And another example is when the object is scratched by the handler's jewelry, or maybe you're wearing a belt buckle and it scratches the object while you're moving it. Things like that. These are just a few examples of physical forces. And so these are examples from my own work. On the left is a map storage, which is overstuffed, resulting in damage. Because the maps on the left were still being used, they were being filtered through, and the edges were actually tearing on them because they weren't being properly handled as well. So on top of being overstuffed and being cracked and rolled, they were getting ripped from misuse. An example on the right is a jukebox in the exhibit area right beside the staff room. And so visitors and staff naturally wanted to lean on it and place things on it because they just wanted to lean on it and talk to the staff and see what's up. And so that's another example, not as severe, but coffee cups definitely were placed on top of it a lot, which was not very appropriate, but it happens. And so what can we do about these issues? So some examples to mitigate the effects of physical forces is, say, when you're moving objects, use a tray or a cart to support the object when you're moving it place to place, or at least hold it in your hands very gently. I always describe objects as babies or cats. You want to handle your baby or cat very gently. Don't just grab it by the leg or tail and whip it around. CCI also has an excellent resource on handling objects, which is linked at the bottom, and I'll share it at the end as well as a resource. Another example is to have items out of the path of a potential bump or a lean. If objects or cases are being leaned on, is there actual adequate sitting areas for visitors? Maybe we can just move the object to a different location. Maybe we'll have to put up some barriers. Start thinking in terms like that. And also treat all objects with the same level of high quality care. Sometimes the educational collection may not be treated as well as the permanent collection, but we still have to treat everything, as a one-of-a-kind thing, because it is. And this is my favorite, but don't be scared to be a little bit mean or politely tell people to be gentle around objects. I'm very polite to visitors, a little bit mean to staff, but even I have to remind myself to not lean on a display case by accident. So it definitely happens. The next agent we'll talk about is thieves and vandals. And so these are premeditated or crimes of opportunity. Now, ironically, thieves and vandals don't usually look like the guy on the left, but usually objects, if they're small, are taken from the exhibit because they're not secured. Maybe they're just in a drawer without a lid or anything. Vandalism of an outdoor sculpture or an outdoor object or your building can be vandalized with spray paint and certain images sprayed painted on there. And items may go missing after a tour of the storage area. A researcher has defaced an archival document after highlighting sections, or, penciling in sections, things like that. Or maybe an object on exhibit has been vandalized in protest as well. So this is an example from my own work. This was an exhibit being set up, and there must have been some miscommunication with the exhibit designer because this front-facing plexiglass situation was made to help prevent people touching the objects. But as seen on the right, it didn't actually help. Like, I could easily reach around and grab things. And so what resulted in this was that everything had to be strapped down. You might be able to see the strapping on the tools, but even the telephone, we had to strap down the receiver and everything. And it still didn't help with dust or light. And people could still touch things. They couldn't take them, but they could still touch them, which was still not ideal. So some mitigation strategies for thieves and vandals. So 1, have objects behind locked, tamper-proof display cases. And now if you have some display cases that don't have that functionality, you can absolutely tweak them to make them work for you. There's lots of resources online that tell you how to do that. Have staff or volunteers walk through the exhibit space periodically. That helps a lot. Vandalism or theft is least likely to occur if there's staff or volunteers around. And during collection tours, ensure bags from visitors are not brought into the space and enough staff are on hand to watch. Because I love giving collection tours, but it's hard for one person to watch, say, 15 or even 10 people in a storage room. So if you have someone extra on hand, just to keep an eye on things, just in case, if possible, have security cameras or even those fake ones, that helps a lot. And having accurate documentation and photos of prone objects will help, especially if it is stolen or misplaced. But if it is stolen, having a picture and accurate description helps a lot with a police investigation, or if you're able to post it on social media, because it's really hard to describe an object from the top of your head unless you just have a picture. And another tip is don't leave researchers or volunteers alone in the collection space or workroom on their own. Sadly, from my experience, a lot of the times when things have been stolen have been when people have been left alone in the storage space. So 3rd one, disassociation. So this is the loss of objects or object-related data, or the ability to retrieve or associate objects and data. So why is this an agent? Well, essentially, the object doesn't necessarily lose its value, but when you don't have the history of it, it makes it really hard to be usable. So say the tag from the object is missing or the accession number is too difficult to read. You're not going to know who donated it, where it came from, or its relevant history without that information. A big one that I've experienced and probably lots of our viewers have experienced is the loss of institutional knowledge due to a longtime staff member or volunteer leaving the museum. Often they have all this information in their head that is never written down, and when they leave, it's gone. It's impossible to get back unless you have them come back and write down everything they know. Another example is a database crash, say Past Perfect or Whimsy or whatever program you're using just goes kaput. And there you go. There goes all that information. Another one is missing object documentation. Maybe you don't have the donor record anymore. The condition reports have been lost, stuff like that. Another example is an object is misplaced. So especially if you have a large storage area or a very messy one, like on the picture on the right, once an object is misplaced and you don't have proper tracking, it can be lost for a long time. And lastly, maybe the storage area is just unorganized, like on the right, which was an example of some offsite storage I was working on. It's chaotic and frankly also dangerous to walk through. And just some quick mitigation strategies for disassociation. Like I mentioned earlier, keeping detailed records and maintaining a collections management policy does help a lot. So you have a donor record, maybe a condition report, a conservation treatment report if you have a conservator on staff, the catalog record, and pictures. And there's a whole other spiel about how to organize that data, which I won't get into, but it is very important. Another one is to have physical and digital records, and to back up the digital records routinely, because if the physical goes kaput, you have the digital. If the digital goes kaput, you have the physical, vice versa. Another one is to label items and parts and to store them together. And if you're not familiar with accessioning or the proper tools for accessioning, there's lots of resources, especially on the CCI website. But I also saw the BCMA has an accessioning toolkit in progress, which is pretty cool. So that'll be up, at some point. Keep your eyes peeled. This is another example of a mitigation strategy. Even I was volunteering at a place where I literally just made little boxes for pins and buttons that were being stored in drawers like these. But having the little boxes was so ideal because it made them easier to find. They fit into the drawers nicely, and they were much easier to handle. So they weren't being dropped by accident or anything like that. So the next agent is fire, and fire is one of the ones that can cause serious damage or total and complete loss of the building, the collections, the operations, and the services as well. And so an example of how fire can enter your facility is candles in an exhibit space from an event potentially. Maybe a textile is way too close to a radiator or other heat source. A cigarette or other source, such as lightning or severe weather, causes the building to catch fire. Maybe there's some faulty electronics. Another one is there are hazardous museum objects being stored, such as cellulose nitrate film. On the right picture there, cellulose nitrate film is actually very hazardous. So one of the mitigation strategies for fire is to be aware of flammables and explosives in your collection. An example that I said already is cellulose nitrate film, picric acid, which is often found in pharmaceutical collections, gunpowder, especially if your facility does reenactments, and maybe weapons such as grenades. So understanding how to properly store these objects and maybe creating separate storage such as a freezer or just a complete separate area, having it locked may be a good idea. Other examples include storing solvents in a ventilated cupboard, especially say if you do have conservation work there being done, storing the solvents properly. Having an emergency response procedure and ensuring staff are aware will help too, because in all honesty, we care about our collections, but we care about our people first. Having smoking zones away from the building and no candles policy. I know we all like candles, but use a battery operated one instead. So the next agent we will talk about is water. And water in its liquid form is destructive, but also when it's introducing dampness, condensation, and rising moisture into the collection space. And so how water can get in is through extreme weather that causes flooding in your facility. Maybe a sprinkler system pipe bursts, a leaking roof, and something as small as a drink is spilled on an object, maybe during an event. A sewer backup, high humidity is also how it can get in. And damage from water can be extensive and also can be irreparable. The picture on the right is an example of a museum storage space that has flooded, and that causes major issues both for the collection but also for health and safety. These are from my own personal work. On the left is a conservation lab I was working in where something in the sink leaked all night. It spread all over the floor, not very high, But there were objects being stored in the lab just on the floor. And thankfully, say it didn't reach the Singer sewing machine on the right there, but it could have reached it, caused damage to the wheels. And thankfully, it didn't reach any other objects being stored, but it was promptly fixed. And it just shows that this stuff can still happen, even in a conservation lab where it definitely shouldn't happen. And on the right is an example of a drink being spilled in an exhibit space. Um, you can see in the picture that it's sticky and pretty gross looking, but at least the objects are in a completely sealed display case, so they were not affected at all, thankfully. But that just shows how easy it is for a drink to just be knocked over and spilt, too. And so some mitigation strategies for water. Like I said just previously, display items behind glass or store objects in containers. That will help keep water off them should the worst happen. In your collection storage space or exhibit space, you can put objects away from pipes. Just be wary of where you're placing things. Just take a look up and go, if that leaks, that would probably be bad. Another tip is to store items 2 to 6 inches off the ground, more like 3. You don't want to place items directly on the floor in case flooding does happen. And if leaking or flooding, or more leaking, is a concern, you can drape shelves with Tyvek or high density polyethylene plastic sheeting, especially if you know maybe routinely there's a small leak in the storage space. You can make sure to drape your shelving there. Avoid storing items in a basement, as again, that's where flooding is more likely to occur. And also do routine checks and maintenance on the building. Say in the conservation lab where I showed that last picture, it turns out that the sink needed to be maintained, and that's why it sprung a leak. And so that could have been completely avoided. And another one, and this is for your working spaces, is to have no open liquids. Do use a water bottle or at least a to-go coffee mug with a sealed lid, because you don't want whatever you're working on to be damaged because you spill over your water by accident. So pests is the next agents we'll be looking at. And so these are living organisms that are able to disfigure, damage, and destroy material culture, because a lot of material culture is very tasty for them. And so mold is actually a pest, and it occurs from high temperature and relative humidity, say in your storage room or exhibit space. Especially in BC, you have to be very aware of that because the humidity is higher than in, say, in other provinces of Canada. Animals and bugs can be attracted to the food in the staff room or workspaces. Say you're having snacks or remnants from your coffee mug and they're still in the garbage. If there's access, the pests will find it. Other pests include rats, mice, raccoons, snakes, and bats. I keep finding bats are a few animal examples that can occur. And a few bugs you may have interacted with include silverfish, drugstore beetles, clothes moths, and termites. And on the picture on the left, that's actually a case-making clothes moth remnant I found while looking in a box of textiles for other things. They weren't in there currently, but their remnants were still there and dead. But that pest did leave some damage in the gauntlets once I did a check. And this was a pest infestation I dealt with. And this occurred in an historic house, and clothes moths completely infested an interpretation room that had all these wool pieces and the only reason it got noticed was an interpreter noticed there was a lot of moss floating around. So they called in the conservator and we pulled all the wool out, and they completely infested all the baskets there. They were in the wool. There was mounds and mounds and mounds of them. And thankfully, they didn't start spreading to the other rooms right away, but they easily could have. So thankfully, this got nipped in the bud very early, but it happens. Here's another example. This is a pair of antlers stored at an offsite location, and a rodent has been chewing on the tips of the antlers because our collections are very tasty for them. So some mitigation strategies for pests. Monitor your temperature and humidity because mold grows at a relative humidity that's 65% and higher. And some pests are more active in a high humidity environment and a high temperature environment. So once you start seeing some pests, that can be indicative that your temperature and humidity is off. Consistently remove trash from staff room and work areas. So I would say do that every day, or accumulate all the trash into one bag every night so it gets taken out by the end of the day. Only have food in staff room, no eating in the collection space, which can be hard if your workspace is the collection space, but you can mitigate strategies from your own at that point. Using sticky traps for pests and live or snap traps for rodents. Filling gaps in architecture, especially with doors that don't have the weather sealing on the bottom. And you want to make sure you close any holes in your structure where pests and rodents can get into. And lastly, check vulnerable collection items such as taxidermy or your textiles, anything like that periodically, because you don't want to check your collection only to realize a massive infestation happened and you didn't realize it. The next one we'll talk about is pollutants. So these are a range of compounds that have chemical reactions with any component of an object. So what's an example of a pollutant? Well, dust. Dust is the most common and most dealt with pollutant we'll deal with in our collections. But dust can be detrimental because it retains moisture and keeps it close to the surface of the object. It causes microabrasions, it attracts pests, and it also dulls the surface. And on the picture on the right there, you'll see that there's some streak marks in the dust because people want to touch a dusty object for some reason. So that's where microabrasions can come from. Another example is sulfur dioxide from a smokestack, especially if you're working in a historic house and actually have a fire on in the fireplace. Another one is formic acid from an unsealed wood display case. Improper cleaning supplies used on or around objects. Say a lot of commercial products actually contain ammonia and silicones, which can be very detrimental to objects as well. Here's an example from my own work. This was when some acidic adhesives and mounting boards were used for a mineral display. They were all taken off, but they left a gross, grimy residue. And even though this was a mineral display, it did affect them because the silver mineral in the display actually tarnished very quickly. When I took it off the display, the back of it was unaffected, but the front, having been exposed to all this acidity, was very tarnished. Here's another example of an outdoor storage site. And because it was outdoors, it frankly, a lot of things just got pooped on, which is not very good for your objects. You'll see in the picture on the right that the motor there just got covered. So it happens. So some mitigation strategies for pollutants. Dust regularly, even in your exhibit space. Just using a soft bristle brush helps a lot. And if you have a HEPA vacuum with variable suction, that helps too. But even just dusting helps a lot. Covering items in storage with, say, Tyvek, cotton sheets, or the HDPE plastic sheets will also keep dust or other pollutants from interacting with your piece. If you're using wood in your storage or exhibit spaces, make sure to seal it so those acids don't leak out. If you can choose what kind of shelving you have, powder-coated metal is the best. And another way to prevent acidity from interacting with your objects is using archival storage materials, which I'll touch on later. I'm not just going to tell you that and not explain that. Oh, here's an example of that offsite storage area. On the left, we were able to cover a lot of the objects in Tyvek sheeting, which will help prevent dust accumulating on everything. Of course, we dusted things first and then put the sheet on top. So that's a way we were mitigating it. So the next agent we'll talk about is light and UV, because it's cumulative and irreparable. We need light to see, but it's also very detrimental to our collections. So an example where that may happen is when an object has not moved in an exhibit space for years. Say with the object on the left, the book, you can see on the spine of the book that the color has completely faded away and there's nothing you can do about it. You know, another way it can happen is when objects are placed directly under a light source. And light and UV causes colors to fade, yellowing, chalking, weakening, and just the general disintegration of materials too. This is an example from my own work. This dress was put on display maybe 20 plus years ago. I knew it was older than me when it was put up, and it was never moved, ever. So those years of light damage have caused it to look like a gray dress when really it used to be a bright, vibrant purple. Once you lifted the armpit, you could see it because the armpit never got sun damage. And so some mitigation strategies for light is to rotate objects on your exhibit. Don't have it up for 20 years. And different objects will require different light levels, especially if they're sensitive materials. CCI has a great way to assess what objects those are. Give that a check out later. You can also monitor and adjust the lux levels. Say the minimum for museum objects is 50 lux. That's about the minimum you can see the object without it straining your eyes too badly. Have a museum quality UV blocking exhibit glass on displays, or you can get UV blocking film on windows too. You can adjust the lighting so it's not directly on the objects, or another way is to use motion or user activated lights. I've seen those a lot, which is really cool. Or another example is to have curtains on your windows. This is an example. I'm pretty sure I saw this in Revelstoke at the Museum and Archives, but I liked that they used a printed sheet with promotional material and local pictures, and they hung them up in the windows. So it still looked good, and it looked good from the outside, but it was able to mitigate the light without letting not enough in though. So that was a good idea. Good job, Revelstoke. On the next one we'll talk, or the last two we'll talk about, is incorrect temperature and humidity. Now I paired these together because these agents go hand in hand, you know, and in this sense, neither should dramatically fluctuate. And when the temperature goes up, the humidity goes down and vice versa. But these can be absolutely, again, detrimental to your collections because in low temperatures, some objects become brittle, you know, such as paintings. In high humidity, the corrosion of metal begins, and humidity and temperature fluctuations can cause wood cracks and warping, paper distortion, a whole whack of issues. And another detrimental thing is that a high humidity will cause mold to grow as well. And again, especially in BC, you have to be very wary of that. And most of the time, when there's temperature fluctuations, that's where the real issue occurs as well, because it's adding a lot of stress to your objects. And so some mitigation strategies for those include using a temperature and humidity data logger in your storage and exhibit space, or at least having a temperature and RH gauge. So you can even just take a look at it and see what's happening. But a data logger would be super helpful though. Another one is to maintain a consistent temperature in RH. And consistency is best because if your area naturally maybe has a high temperature in RH, that's okay so long as it doesn't fluctuate a lot. Say, especially because I'm from Saskatchewan, our temperature in RH is different than say BC, but so long as things stay consistent, it's better. Another way is to prepare for known fluctuating months, such as the summer. So if you know the humidity in your collection storage area gets really high in the summer, be prepared for it. Have some fans and humidifiers in the space to make sure things don't get too high so mold doesn't develop and rust doesn't develop on your pieces. Another way is to keep objects away from air vents and outer walls because they tend to be a bit more drafty. Ensure the building is properly insulated and has no leaks. That'll help with your water issue as well if that's occurring. And another way is to use storage containers, envelopes, and encapsulation on vulnerable objects because it just provides another buffer layer from the environment. So now that we've gone through the agents of deterioration, I'll go through archival materials, but also what does archival mean? Because archival does mean it's suitable quality to be used in archives, but it has no legally binding meaning. Technically, anything is archival for a certain amount of time. Same with acid-free. Acid-free means the material has a neutral pH at the time of testing. So that doesn't mean that the material won't become acidic in the future, though. And so if a material doesn't explain why it's archival, I wouldn't trust it. But I'll explain some of the terms I use when I'm looking for archival materials. So one of them, these are some things you'll see on materials when you buy them. The first one is the photoactivity test, or the PAT test. This is a test that evaluates materials for archival quality and their use in photographic enclosures. You'll usually see this on paper-based products. Another one is light fastness, and this describes how resistant to fading a material is when exposed to light. And this is based off the blue wool scale, which is interesting to heritage nerds like me who want to look into it later. Also, these items usually have the EP certified logo, which means that's non-toxic. And these are on pigment-based products, such as the Micron pen on the right there. And you'll see it also, say, on acrylic paints and things like that too. And the last thing is when something is labeled PVC free. So polyvinyl chloride is full of a plasticizer, which degrades and off-gases over time, and a benzoic acid, which degrades copper and bronze. So these are often seen on plastic-based products, such as the rubber eraser on the right there. And so on paper-based archival materials, you'll want to look for lignin-free. So this is the natural bonding material that holds wood fibers together and that has been mechanically removed. So it won't discolor yellow over time. And this is why newsprint yellows. It's sulfur-free or has a low sulfur content. It's often made from cotton rag, high alpha cellulose pulp or equivalent, and should not have groundwood, unbleached pulp, or optical brighteners. You'll see these in storage boxes, museum board, tissue paper, materials like that. So here's a fun little verses. So Walmart does sell an archival grade tissue, but I put it in comparison with the Gaylord archival acid-free tissue. The Walmart brand, it says it's acid-free. Okay, but why? Why is it acid-free? You can't just tell us that. Whereas the Gaylord archival acid-free tissue, explains that it's made from 100% virgin wood fibers. And that also passes the PAT test. And even on their website, it goes into more description. And so once you know what terms to look for, you'll start to see what materials may be best to use for your collection. And now for plastic-based archival material, the best ones to use are polyester, polyethylene, polypropylene, and high-density polyethylene. These are all archival quality plastics. The ones you want to avoid are polyvinyl chloride and polyurethane products. So say Coroplast sheets are made from polypropylene, which is great. Tyvek, which I've mentioned before, is made from 100% high density polyethylene non-woven olefin fiber, which is also, again, really great. Mylar is made from polyester, often used in encapsulation. And I'll just throw this in there, but bubble wrap is evil. Don't use it. It's usually made from low density polyethylene. And I say usually because it was hard just finding exact descriptions and materials of what bubble wrap is made out of. And it also has a lot of unknown plasticizers. Definitely don't use that for long-term storage. Temporary, sure. Long-term, no. Here's another versus. So we have the Dollarama sheet protectors versus the Staples sheet protectors. So Dollarama says it's made of transparent plastic. Okay, not even what type of plastic? Thanks, Dollarama, very helpful. But the Staples sheet protectors does describe it as a polypropylene sheet, which are acid-free and archival safe. Sweet, thanks, Staples. That's actually very helpful. And in the end, you want to focus on preventative conservation techniques. Unless you have a conservator in your pocket, there are ways you can use these techniques in your own collection. So absolutely monitor your temperature, RH, and light exposure. Use proper museum handling techniques. Having adequate storage for objects will help a lot, especially to prevent, say, them getting crushed, things like that. Using archival storage materials and dusting items with a soft bristle brush and a vacuum if you have it is absolutely great. Dust is a huge proponent of and deterioration agent. If you do need to do some wet cleaning on an object, definitely consult a conservator first. And appropriate materials can be bought frugally. Usually just takes a bit of looking. A lot of my materials I bought from, say, Home Hardware, Rona, places like that. And a big thing, do not attempt conservation techniques on your own. Don't trust Google. Consult an experienced conservator, especially when, Google tells you to use vinegar, lemons, potatoes, and other weird Pinterest hacks on your objects. No, just ask someone. We'll tell you what to use. Don't be scared of us. And lastly, I'll go over some resources that I really love. One of them is the Canadian Association for Conservation of Cultural Property. This is a conservation resource, and it's a member I'm a part of. And so I followed their ethics when doing conservation work. If you're looking for a conservator, you can consult the CAC here. Another one you can consult is the Canadian Association of Professional Conservators. You can also consult them. Both the CAPC and CAC usually has members listed by region if you're looking for someone specific, or even by trade if you specifically need a metal conservator, art conservator, textiles conservator, stuff like that. And the big one, the Canadian Conservation Institute, is an awesome, amazing resource. They have the Agents of Deterioration on their website. So I went very fast, had a lot to go over. So definitely check out CCI for more resources on the agents. The ones with stars, I love, love, love. They're great resources and not a lot of people know about them. So Connecting to Collections has a large online free webinar archive anyone can check out. And they have topics on anything and everything you've ever pondered about in heritage and conservation and preservation. It's an amazing resource. The next one is Storage Techniques for Art, Science, and History, or Stash C. So this is where people have uploaded their own specs and templates for making custom storage boxes or unique storage ideas or frugal storage ideas for their collections. So especially if you're working with some weird or oddly shaped objects, or you just need some more frugal ideas for storage, Stash C is amazing. The next one is Museum Pests. So again, this is a free online resource where you can learn more about pests, what they look like, and there's even a mailing server where you can ask questions to have pests identified in your collection. The next one is the National Park Service conservagrams. Again, this is like CCI where they have topics on everything and everything you've ever pondered in heritage or storage, preservation. Just again, an amazing resource. Check those out. And on the right is some examples where you can get products such as Carr McLean, which is Canadian based, Talus, University Products, Gaylord Archival, or local hardware stores. Again, I found a lot of my tools such as scalpels, knives, solvents from, Canadian Tire, things like that. Even art supply and craft stores can have the materials you're looking for, especially if you know what you're looking for, knowing the archival terms and whatnot, and your community, your volunteers, the town or city and community you live in will absolutely help. Say, even in a place I worked at, we needed more sheets for covering objects that were being we needed sheets for an outdoor heritage village that was being closed up for the winter. And so they asked the volunteer community if anyone had spare white cotton bed sheets, and the community provided. It was amazing. And then people love just being able to help out too. And so I hope that helped. I'm going to provide, all these resources, my notes from this webinar, and also my master list of where to get some common archival materials. I will also provide as a resource too. And I'm going to pass it off and we'll see if anyone had some questions. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take over sharing my screen again. That was wonderful. I definitely learned a lot. I just wanted to open it up to any questions. So if you want to use the chat or Q&A box, I will read your questions out to Raene. We did have someone already pose the question of gaining access to the presentation slides so that they can have those resources. I'll be sending out those resources in our follow-up email that happens after every webinar, where you'll also have access to the recording of the webinar so you can watch it again and again. And I'll include those links that Raene shared with us. Oh, and look at that. I already see something. Oh, it was just a thank you from Jennifer in the chat saying really great information.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm just
so
gonna,
nice. Everyone's so
yeah,
supportive.
right. I'm just going to give us one sec. Okay, so a question from Heather here. Raene mentioned keeping a consistent temperature and RH. Is there an ideal window for these figures?
There actually is. For a temperature, you want to try and keep it within 20 to 21 degrees. And then for your RH, you want to try and keep it within 45 to 55%, plus or minus, 5% from there, because that's the ideal temperature. But oftentimes the ideal temperature can be impossible to achieve in your facility, especially if you're working in a historic house that doesn't have, an HVAC system or anything like that. The best you can do is to try and keep it consistent, especially if naturally your facility has maybe a little bit of a higher temperature and humidity. But so long as that's natural to the area, your objects are used to that too. So keeping it consistent within the natural state of your institution is best.
Thank you. I'm just going to give us another moment or two in case anyone is currently pondering a question or typing it out. While I'm doing that, Raene, I just want to pass along that Heather says thank you for answering her question there.
Oh, you're welcome. And it's also on the CCI website, a more thorough and better description of temperature and humidity as well.
I'm just going to give us one more moment in case anyone's rapidly typing something out. I don't see anything coming through, so that's great. If anyone has questions afterwards, what's a good place that they could seek out answers?
Oh, sure. Well, definitely the Canadian Conservation Institute, but also the CAC and CAPCR, those Canadian conservation places, you can absolutely just send them an email with your questions too. They're happy to answer them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I will just wrap it up then. I want to thank you so much, Raine, for joining us today. This was absolutely wonderful. I learned a lot, as conservation is not a realm I'm very familiar with. So this was really helpful as an introduction for me. So thank you so very much for joining us and sharing with us. I also really want to thank all of our attendees today and all the folks who registered for the webinar and for joining us today as well. I do want to share with you some stuff we have going on in December. So consider joining us on Wednesday, December 9th. That's this Wednesday for our resume and interviewing tips for tourism and hospitality jobs webinar. We'll be joined by Go2HR, and they'll talk about things like how to make your cover letter stand out, resume formatting, how to communicate those skills that you're not sure how to communicate, best tips for applying for a job that you are passionate about but underqualified for, and how to get it. Once you get the interview, what's a way to nail that interview? So all those kind of things. And then Wednesday, December 16th for our Water Cooler Wednesdays, I'll be hosting a holiday party. So consider joining us from 5 until 6 p.m. for our holiday celebration. There'll be games, there'll be songs, there'll be hot cocoa, virtual, of course. And please, if you have any suggestions for topics in 2021 or wish to present a webinar yourself, you can email me at programs@museumsasn.bc.ca or fill out the follow-up survey that will be in your inbox shortly. If you do not get the follow-up survey link, please send me an email at that email address there so I can set you up. And do consider becoming a member of the BCMA. Becoming a member provides funding opportunities, free webinar participation, reduced registration fees, access to professional development resources, and so much more. Thank you again, Raine, for joining us. And for everyone else, have a wonderful afternoon.